My son crossed a line in my kitchen that night, not a line you step back from, not a line you apologize your way out of. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I stayed silent. The sound that followed wasn't yelling. It was the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking on the wall, and my own breathing, slow, controlled, almost unfamiliar. He stood there for a moment, waiting for tears, waiting for fear, waiting for the version of me that had always backed down. But I didn't give him that. He scoffed, turned his back, and walked out of the kitchen like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just taken something from me that could never be returned. His footsteps faded down the hallway, heavy and careless, and a door slammed somewhere in the house. Then there was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe you. The kind that presses against your chest and makes you aware of every inch of your own body. I stayed where I was, my hands resting on the edge of the counter. I could feel the cool surface under my palms. I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before, a small crack in the tile, the faint smell of soap, the way the light from the stove cast a shadow across the floor. In that moment, I understood something with a clarity that frightened me. This wasn't a bad night. This wasn't stress. This wasn't anger. This was a verdict. I didn't follow him. I didn't lock my door. I didn't cry. I went to the sink and rinsed my mouth with cold water. When I looked up, my reflection stared back at me, older than I felt, steadier than I expected. My lip was swelling, just enough to ache, just enough to remind me that what had happened was real. I turned off the light and went to bed without saying a word. Sleep didn't come easily, but I didn't toss and turn either. I lay there, listening to the house settle, listening to him move upstairs at some point, listening until the sounds became predictable again, familiar, almost routine. That was when I made my decision. By the time morning arrived, I wasn't afraid anymore. I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet, wrapped in that pale blue light that only exists for a few minutes each day. I put on my robe and walked into the kitchen as if it were any other morning. I started the coffee. The sound of it brewing filled the room, rich and warm, completely out of place. I took out the plates I usually saved for special occasions. I set the table carefully, smoothing the cloth with deliberate hands. I cooked more than usual. Eggs, toast, fruit, enough for a meal that looked like forgiveness. When he came downstairs, I could hear the confidence in his steps. He expected avoidance. He expected tension. What he didn't expect was the smell of breakfast. He stopped in the doorway. For just a second, his expression flickered. Confusion, maybe even relief. Then he smiled. Not a kind smile. The kind that says he believes the night before ended in his favor. He sat down without being invited. Didn't mention what happened, didn't ask if I was all right, didn't notice my lip. He reached for his plate like the matter was settled, and I watched him. I didn't sit, I didn't speak. I stood there, my hands resting lightly on the chair behind me, my posture calm, my face unreadable. He thought my silence meant acceptance. He thought breakfast meant apology. He thought this was the moment everything went back to the way it was. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the night before, my silence hadn't been fear. It had been preparation. And that morning wasn't about food. It was about what was coming next. Before my son became the man who crossed an unforgivable line, he was just a quiet little boy who believed his mother could hold the world together with two tired hands. I became a widow long before I was ready to be strong. His father left for work one ordinary morning, kissed me on the cheek, promised to bring home bread on the way back. By nightfall, I was sitting in a hospital corridor, holding my son's small, trembling hand, listening to words no wife is ever prepared to hear. Heart attack. Sudden. No pain, they said, as if that made it easier. From that night on, it was just the two of us. I didn't feel heroic. I felt hollow. I felt like a woman standing on a cracked floor, trying not to fall while pretending everything was fine. But when a child looks up at you with wide eyes full of fear, you don't get the luxury of breaking down. You become solid. You become quiet. You become dependable. I worked everywhere that would have me. Early mornings at a local library shelving books, afternoons cleaning offices that smelled like stale coffee and paper, evenings sewing hems, buttons, torn jackets for neighbors who paid in cash and gratitude. My fingers were often sore, my back stiff before I even turned 40, but I never complained. Complaining felt like weakness, and weakness felt dangerous. Money was always counted twice. I kept envelopes in a drawer in the kitchen. Rent, utilities, food, school. A small one marked future. Some weeks that envelope stayed empty, but I kept it anyway. Hope needs a place to sit, even when it has nothing inside it. Meals were simple but warm. Breakfast at the same time every morning. Dinner together at the small table, no television, just conversation. Homework spread across the table while I folded laundry nearby. Routine wasn't boring to me. Routine was safety. Years later, when I finally saved enough to put a down payment on a house, I sat alone on the living room floor and cried. It wasn't a new house. It creaked when you walked, the paint peeled in places, the porch boards complained under your feet, but there was a massive oak tree out front, older than all of us, steady and unmoved by storms. That house wasn't just shelter, it was proof that we survived. Birthdays were celebrated in the dining room, Christmas mornings left wrapping paper everywhere. Summer evenings were spent on the porch, listening to cicadas while my son talked about school, dreams, and a future I prayed would be kinder to him than life had been to me. His father should have been there to see it. But he wasn't. So I became everything. The soft voice when he was scared. The firm one when he tested boundaries. I attended every parent-teacher meeting, every school event, every performance. I clapped louder than anyone else, even when he pretended not to notice. Teachers told me I was raising a respectful boy. Neighbors praised his manners. Church members smiled and said, "You're doing a good job." I believed them. I watched my son grow taller, stronger, more confident. I saw flashes of his father in the way he stood, in the way he tried to act brave when things got hard. Pride filled the spaces where grief once lived. I didn't resent the exhaustion. I didn't count the years of sacrifice, because every late night, every missed rest, every aching joint had a purpose. Everything I built for him. Back then, love felt simple, solid, permanent. I never imagined that the same house I fought so hard to protect would one day feel like a place I needed protection from. As my son grew older, I began to believe we had outrun tragedy. He did well in school, not perfect, but steady. Teachers said he was polite, focused, respectful. He held doors open. He spoke when spoken to. He carried groceries for elderly neighbors without being asked. People would stop me after church and say, "You raised him right." Those words mattered more than they should have. They became my reassurance, my proof that all the sacrifice had not been wasted, that every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every dollar stretched thin had built something good. When he graduated high school, I cried harder than I did at my own wedding. I watched him walk across that stage and thought, we did it, against grief, against money problems, against loneliness. We did it. College came next. He was the first in our family. I worked more hours to help with tuition, took on extra sewing, said no to new shoes, new furniture, anything unnecessary. When money got tight, I told myself it was temporary, an investment. Just get through this, I'd whisper to myself at night. Just a few more years. When his father passed, he promised me something. We were standing in the kitchen, late at night, dishes still on the table. He looked so grown then, taller than me, his voice steady but his eyes wet. "I'll take care of you now, Mom," he said. "I won't let anything happen to you." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. After college, he came back home, said it would only be for a little while, just until he got settled, just until he saved enough to move out. I didn't hesitate. Why would I? That house had always been ours. Family didn't need permission. At first, everything felt normal. He helped with bills, fixed small things around the house, sat with me in the evenings, took me to church on Sundays. Neighbors smiled when they saw us together, mother and son, strong, close. But slowly, something shifted. It wasn't loud at first. It was subtle. A change in tone, less patience, a sigh when I asked a question, irritation over small things. He started coming home later, talking less, drinking more, though I pretended not to notice. When money got tight for him, he asked to borrow, then asked again, then stopped asking and simply took. I told myself it was temporary. That stress does strange things to people, that a mother's job is to endure. I kept the house peaceful, clean, predictable. I learned to read his moods the way sailors read weather. The sound of his footsteps told me everything. The way he closed the door. The way he breathed when he walked into a room. I adjusted myself around him. I spoke softer, asked less, needed nothing. That's the part no one tells you about sacrifice. At some point, you stop noticing how much of yourself is gone. Still, I held on to pride. I told myself, this is still my son. This is still the boy I raised. This is just a hard season. The house still carried the past. Photos on the shelves, his childhood drawings in a box under the bed, his father's chair by the window. Everything reminded me of who we used to be. I believed memory had power, that love, if patient enough, could fix anything. I was wrong. But at that time, standing inside the life I had built brick by brick, I truly believed my sacrifices had secured us both a future. I didn't yet understand that sometimes the things we give the most to are the very things that learn how to hurt us best. I didn't realize fear had entered my home all at once. It arrived quietly, the way mold creeps into old walls, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly it's everywhere. My son's failures didn't come with sirens. They came disguised as bad luck, a missed promotion, a job restructuring, a boss who didn't respect him. Every setback came with a reason, and every reason came with someone else to blame. At first, it wasn't me. He blamed the company, the system, the economy, the world. I listened. I nodded. I made dinner. But frustration, when it has nowhere to go, looks for a target. And I was the closest one. He began to hover when I paid bills, standing behind me at the kitchen counter, watching the numbers on the screen longer than necessary, asking questions that didn't sound like curiosity, but audits. How much is left? Why are you still paying for that? Didn't Dad leave more than this? I laughed it off at first, told myself he was just stressed, that men feel useless when they lose control of their lives. I reassured him, repeated myself, explained things I had already explained before. Then came the comments. You don't need that. That's a waste. Why are you still holding on to this old junk? He said it casually, too casually. The house changed tone before it changed shape. Conversations became shorter, silences longer. I started timing my movements, waiting until he left the room before checking my phone, paying bills, even watching television. The first time he raised his voice at me, it was over something small, a dripping faucet. The sound bothered me. I asked, gently, if he could fix it when he had time. He didn't look up. Let it drip, he snapped. The words hit harder than they should have, not because of what he said, but how he said it. Sharp, dismissive, as if I were an inconvenience interrupting his life. I stood there holding wet greens in my hands, water running over my fingers, unsure what to say next. When I tried to explain, that was when his chair scraped loudly against the floor, when he stood, when he loomed. That was the first moment my body reacted before my mind did. My chest tightened, my hands went cold. Something ancient inside me whispered, "Be careful." After that, money became a battlefield. He stopped asking to borrow. He started declaring. Bills were ours. Savings were shared. Decisions needed his approval. If I hesitated, he reminded me of everything he'd sacrificed, everything his father had worked for. "This is my house, too," he said one night, loud enough to echo off the kitchen walls. That sentence changed everything. It wasn't just ownership he was claiming. It was authority. From that day on, I felt like a guest in my own life. My routine bent around his moods. If he was drinking, I stayed quiet. If he was angry, I disappeared. I learned how to make myself small without realizing I was doing it. Dinner became the hardest part of the day. We sat across from each other at the same table where birthdays had once been celebrated. He ate fast, loud, barely looked at me. When he did, his eyes carried a tension I didn't recognize, resentment mixed with entitlement. I stopped inviting friends over, made excuses. I'm tired. My joints are acting up. The truth felt too shameful to say out loud. Fear doesn't always look like screaming. Sometimes it looks like calculating when it's safe to speak. Sometimes it looks like memorizing footsteps. Sometimes it looks like a mother praying her own child will just go to bed without a word. That's when I knew something was wrong. Not broken. Twisted. The house still stood. The walls were the same. The memories were still there. But something dark had begun pacing the halls with me. And it wasn't leaving. The control didn't arrive with fists. It arrived with rules. Unspoken at first, then enforced. He started questioning where I went, how long I stayed, who I talked to. If I came home later than usual, he'd ask why. Not with concern, with suspicion. Where were you? Who were you with? You didn't answer your phone. I explained myself like a child asking permission. I told myself it was temporary, that once he found steady work again, once life stopped disappointing him, things would soften. They didn't. His voice became the loudest object in the house. Even when he wasn't yelling, it carried weight, authority, expectation. I learned to listen for it the way people listen for thunder. The night dinners turned tense. I stopped tasting food. We would sit across from each other under the yellow kitchen light, plates between us like borders. He'd eat fast, barely chew, eyes fixed somewhere past me. When I spoke, he'd sigh. When I stayed silent, he'd accuse me of judging him. What are you looking at me like that for? I'm not, I'd answer. Yes, you are. There was no winning. Money became his favorite weapon. He demanded access, statements, explanations. If I hesitated, he reminded me of his father, of sacrifices, of how much he had lost. You wouldn't even have this house if it wasn't for him, he said once, his voice low but sharp, and I'm his son. That sentence landed like a threat. I began hiding receipts, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because peace became more valuable than truth. I delayed paying bills until I knew he was asleep. I memorized PIN numbers like secrets instead of safeguards. Fear doesn't announce itself. It trains you. I stopped singing while I cooked, stopped humming, stopped turning on the radio. Silence felt safer than sound. One evening, my neighbor knocked on the door, just to check in. I hadn't answered her calls in days. I lied through my smile, told her my joints were acting up, that I was resting. Behind me, I could feel him standing in the hallway, listening. After she left, he asked why she was so interested, why she needed to know our business. That was the first time I realized he wasn't just angry, he was isolating me. I began to feel watched in my own home. Every movement measured, every decision questioned. If I forgot something, it became proof of incompetence. If I remembered too much, it became suspicion. This is my house too, he repeated whenever I resisted, louder each time, like he was convincing himself. At night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. The tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, his footsteps upstairs. I learned the rhythm of his moods by sound alone. Heavy steps meant danger. Soft ones meant drinking. Silence meant tension waiting to explode. I prayed differently then. Not for happiness, not for change, just for quiet. Please, I whispered into the dark. Let him go to sleep. That was when fear stopped being abstract and became physical. A tightness in my chest. A constant ache behind my eyes. My body reacting before my thoughts could catch up. I started locking my bedroom door at night, just in case. I told myself it was nothing. Old habits. Overthinking. But deep down, something ancient was awake inside me. Something that knew when safety had left. The house no longer felt like mine. It felt like territory, And I was living on borrowed ground, waiting for the moment when words would no longer be enough to keep the peace. That's when I understood the truth I had been avoiding. The man living under my roof was no longer my son asking for help. He was someone testing how far he could go, and fear had already crossed the threshold. That night didn't begin with shouting. It began with silence. The kind of silence that hums in your ears where every small sound feels louder than it should. The clock ticking too clearly, the refrigerator clicking on and off, the house holding its breath. It was late when I heard the key scrape against the door, not the familiar sound of someone coming home tired, but careless, angry, off rhythm. The lock rattled longer than usual. When the door finally opened, cold air rushed in with the smell of rain and alcohol. I stayed where I was, sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded in my lap, pretending not to listen as his shoes hit the floor unevenly. I had learned that stillness sometimes passed for invisibility. He didn't say my name at first. He threw his keys onto the counter. Something clattered. Something small rolled across the floor. I didn't look. Looking felt like an invitation. When he stepped into the kitchen, the light above the stove caught his face just enough for me to see it wasn't really him standing there. Not the boy I raised, not the man I remembered, just anger wearing his shape. "What are you doing up?" he asked, voice thick, words slurring together. "I couldn't sleep," I said. That was the wrong answer. I could tell by the way his shoulders stiffened, by the way he filled the doorway as if blocking my exit without moving an inch closer. "You always do this," he muttered, sitting there, watching, judging. I shook my head slowly. "I'm not judging you." "You think I'm stupid?" he snapped. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. Every instinct in my body told me to stay small, stay calm, stay quiet. I spoke the way you speak to someone you're afraid of waking fully. "You're tired," I said. "You've been drinking. Let's talk in the morning." The words landed wrong. His laugh was short and sharp, without humor. He took a step closer. The air shifted. Something invisible crossed between us. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he said. That's when I felt it. Not fear exactly, but certainty. The certainty that something had already gone too far. My body reacted before my mind could reason. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. My hands gripped the edge of the chair without me telling them to. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to explain. I just stayed still. He moved again, too fast for my eyes to follow clearly. The chair beside me tipped. Something shattered on the floor. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a crack in glass. I remember thinking how strange it was that the house sounded louder than my thoughts. He loomed over me then, close enough that I could smell alcohol on his breath. I kept my eyes down. I didn't want to see his face up close. My silence made him angrier. "Say something," he demanded. I didn't, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood something in that moment with terrifying clarity. This was no longer about words. This was about power, about how far he could push without consequence. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I didn't fight back. I stayed exactly where I was. Time stretched. Seconds felt heavy. The room felt smaller, darker, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. Then, just as suddenly as it began, he stepped away. I heard his breath, sharp and uneven, heard his footsteps retreat, heard the stairs creak as he went upstairs without looking back. The sound of his bedroom door closing felt final. I sat there long after he was gone. The kitchen smelled wrong. Metal, alcohol, something broken. The floor was littered with pieces of something that used to belong in my home. A chair lay on its side like a body after a fall. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I just sat there, shaking, staring at nothing, understanding one irreversible truth. That night, something broke forever. The house didn't settle after he went upstairs. It stayed awake with me. I could hear him moving above my head, drawers opening, water running, footsteps pacing the floor. Each sound made my muscles tense, waiting for him to come back down. He didn't. And somehow that felt worse. I stayed in the kitchen, sitting exactly where I was. The chair beside me lay on its side. Something broken glinted on the floor, catching the dim light. I didn't clean it up. I didn't stand. My body felt heavy, like gravity had doubled. I realized then that fear has weight. It presses on your chest. It slows your breathing. It makes time stretch thin. I stared at my hands resting in my lap. They were shaking, not violently, just enough to notice. I pressed my palms together to stop it, the way I used to calm my son when he was small. That thought nearly undid me. I walked slowly to the bathroom, turning on the light with a hand that didn't feel like mine. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized. My face looked older than it had that morning. Not from wrinkles, from something deeper. Shock, maybe. Or clarity. I splashed cold water on my face. Once? Twice. The chill grounded me. When I looked up again, I wasn't seeing a victim. I was seeing a woman who had just crossed an invisible border. Back in the kitchen, I picked up one piece from the floor. It was something small, familiar, something that had belonged in my home for years. I set it gently on the counter, then stopped. Why was I being careful? Why was I protecting the space he had just violated? That was when the truth landed, heavy and undeniable. If I stayed silent after tonight, I would be agreeing to what came next, not with words, but with survival. I thought about the future then, not in big images, just fragments. Another night like this, another apology in the morning, another promise to change, another chair knocked over, another thing broken. And one day maybe it wouldn't be a chair. I imagined myself older, slower, less able to move away, less able to endure. I imagined fear becoming routine, not emergency. That thought scared me more than what had already happened. I went back to the kitchen table and sat down again, deliberately. I rested my hands flat on the surface and breathed slowly until my heart obeyed. That was when something inside me hardened. Not anger, not hatred, resolve. I understood something I had avoided for years. Love without boundaries becomes permission. My silence had taught him that he could cross lines and still come home to peace. Tonight showed me where that path ended. I didn't sleep. I listened to the house until dawn. When the sky began to lighten through the kitchen window, I felt strangely calm. The fear was still there, but it had shifted. It no longer ruled me. I stood up as the morning light touched the floor and looked around the kitchen. The mess remained. The tipped chair, the broken pieces, evidence. I didn't erase it. Instead, I made a decision so quiet it almost felt unreal. I would not scream. I would not confront him in anger. I would not beg for understanding. I would act. That night didn't just frighten me, it woke me up. For the first time in a long time, I stopped asking myself how to keep the peace and started asking how to keep myself alive. Not just breathing, but whole. The house was silent now, but it felt different, less oppressive, as if it too was waiting for me to choose. And I had. That night, something broke forever, but something else was born in its place, a line, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never step back across it again. The house didn't feel dangerous anymore. It felt quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed but before anyone dares to step outside, the kind of quiet where every decision sounds louder than fear. I didn't go back to bed. Instead, I turned on the kitchen light. The glow was soft, steady, familiar. This room had held my entire life. It had witnessed birthdays, prayers, laughter, and grief. Tonight it would witness something else. Clarity. I washed my hands and tied my apron the way I always had, not because I planned to cook for him, but because routine steadied my breathing, because my hands needed something honest to do, flour, butter, milk. I mixed the dough slowly, deliberately, each movement measured. The smell grounded me in my body, in the present. I wasn't shaking anymore. Fear had burned itself out. As I worked, I listened. The house remained silent. No footsteps upstairs, no doors opening. just the low hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Time was moving again. While the dough rested, I sat at the table and opened the drawer beneath it, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents I kept not out of attachment but responsibility. The deed, the insurance papers, the will. I laid them out neatly, smoothing each page as if order itself could speak. The names were clear, the dates precise. Everything I needed to know was already written down. This house was mine, not emotionally, not symbolically, legally. I realized then how dangerous ignorance can be, especially when fear convinces you that love requires blindness. I hadn't checked these papers in years because I trusted the man who lived upstairs. Trust had cost me more than sleep. I stood and returned to the kitchen, rolled the dough, cut it cleanly, placed each piece on the tray with care. The oven warmed the room as night leaned toward morning. I wasn't cooking for comfort. I was preparing myself. While the first tray baked, I poured coffee. Black. Strong. The bitterness sharpened my focus. I didn't sit. I didn't rest. I picked up the phone. My hand hovered over the screen for a moment, not from doubt but from understanding the weight of what came next. Once I made the call, there would be no pretending this was just a bad night. I dialed. The line rang longer than I expected. When the voice finally answered, calm and professional, I felt something in my chest loosen. I didn't cry. I didn't explain everything. I spoke plainly. My name is... I need advice regarding my property and personal safety. Yes, it involves my adult son. There was no judgment in the silence on the other end, just attention, just law, just structure. I listened carefully, took notes, asked questions I had never allowed myself to ask before. What were my rights? What were my options? What did safety look like? Legally, not emotionally? The answers didn't scare me, they steadied me. When I hung up, dawn was approaching. Pale light crept through the kitchen window, catching the edge of the table, the papers, the cooling tray of food. I looked around the room and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness. Not triumph. Relief. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't setting a trap. I was planning survival. I stacked the documents carefully, placed them back in the drawer, but this time I knew exactly where they were. I cleaned the counter, washed my hands again. The oven timer chimed softly. Morning was coming. As the night thinned into morning, my movements became deliberate, almost ceremonial. Not rushed, not hesitant, precise. I laid the dining table the way I used to on holidays, when order made the house feel safe. The tablecloth was smooth, the plates aligned, cups placed evenly, handles facing the same direction. I wasn't expecting guests yet, but I was preparing the room to witness truth. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, loud enough to remind me that time was still moving forward. I wasn't frozen anymore. Fear no longer owned my hours. I sat down and opened the small notebook I usually kept for grocery lists and church reminders. That night it became a record. I wrote slowly, not emotions, not accusations, just facts. The time he came home, the sound of the key, where I was sitting, what was knocked over, what was broken, when he went upstairs. Each sentence was short, clean, undeniable. I didn't allow myself to soften anything. Truth doesn't need comfort, it needs accuracy. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it next to the stack of documents from earlier, the deed, the insurance papers, the will. Together they formed something solid, something that could not be argued away or rewritten by someone louder than me. I stood and walked through the house, not pacing, inspecting. I checked the doors and windows, locked them, then checked again. The sound of the locks clicking into place didn't frighten me, it reassured me. It sounded like intention. Upstairs, his bedroom door was still closed. I stopped in front of it for just a moment, not to listen, not to knock, just to acknowledge that this space, this boundary, finally existed. A closed door is not always rejection. Sometimes it is protection. I turned away and went back downstairs. The kitchen was warm now, faintly lit by the oven light and the first hints of dawn. The smell of food lingered, comforting but distant. I poured another cup of coffee, black and strong, and stood by the window watching the sky slowly change color. For years, I had mistaken endurance for strength. I had believed that keeping peace meant staying silent, that love meant absorbing harm without protest, that being a good mother required me to disappear a little more each day. That night taught me otherwise. Silence, when it protects abuse, is not kindness, it is permission. I reviewed my plan again, calmly. No confrontation, no raised voices, no emotional explanations. There would be witnesses, there would be law, there would be consequences that did not depend on my ability to argue or persuade. If he woke angry, I would not respond. If he pretended nothing happened, I would not correct him. If he demanded answers, I would offer none. My preparation was already complete. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Waiting felt different now, not tense, not fearful, patient. Like someone sitting in a courtroom before the judge enters, knowing the verdict will be based on facts, not volume. The clock crept closer to morning. Eventually, I heard movement upstairs, a bed creaking, a drawer sliding open, water running, ordinary sounds that once would have sent my heart racing. This time, they didn't. I didn't look toward the stairs. I didn't rehearse a speech in my head. I didn't prepare myself to defend or explain. Stillness was my answer. I realized then how unsettling calm can be to someone who expects resistance, how power slips away when there is nothing to push against. This wasn't a standoff. It was a conclusion. The house, now bathed in pale morning light, looked the same. Same walls, same furniture, same memories. But the air had changed. It no longer felt like a place where fear lived. It felt like mine again. I straightened my posture, smoothed the edge of the tablecloth, and took one slow breath. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't seeking punishment. I was choosing survival. And survival doesn't shout. It prepares quietly, it documents carefully, and it moves only once, when there is no turning back. Morning arrived wearing a costume of normalcy. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window, pale and gentle, as if the night had never happened. The air smelled of coffee and warm bread. The table was set neatly. Everything looked calm enough to fool a stranger. I sat at the head of the table, hands folded, posture straight. Not rigid, composed. My face was still, my eyes steady. I heard him coming down the stairs. Not cautiously, not quietly, confident. His footsteps were heavy, unbothered, like a man who slept well and woke up certain of his place in the world. When he entered the kitchen, he barely glanced at me. His eyes went straight to the table. "Well," he said, stretching his arms, "look at this." He smirked. I didn't answer. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down without asking. Reached for the food like it was owed to him, like the night before had been erased by sleep. He took a bite, chewed slowly, deliberately. Then he laughed, a low, satisfied sound. "See?" he said with his mouth half full. "I knew you'd calm down." I kept my gaze on him, not angry, not pleading, just present. He mistook my silence for surrender. "That's how it always goes," he continued, pouring himself coffee without asking. "You get dramatic, then you remember who runs things around here." The word dramatic landed heavily. I didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, confidence growing with every second I refused to react. He had always been like this, louder when unchecked, crueler when comfortable. "You know," he added, shaking his head, "most women your age would be grateful. Roof over their head, someone taking charge." He smiled again. A smile built on assumption. I studied his face, the ease, the entitlement, the certainty that fear had done its job, that whatever line he crossed the night before had landed exactly where he intended. He thought silence meant obedience. He took another bite, crumbs scattered across the tablecloth. He didn't notice, or care. "I told you," he said, pointing his fork vaguely in my direction. "This is my house too. You don't get to sit there acting like some kind of judge." Still, I said nothing. Inside me, something old and painful twisted. Not fear this time, but grief. Grief for the boy who once waited for me to sit before he ate, the boy who asked before taking seconds, the boy who used to say please without being reminded. That boy was gone. You really had me worried for a second last night, he continued, laughing softly. Sitting there like that, not saying anything. I thought you were going to make a scene. He shook his head. But look at you now, he said, eyes flicking over me. Back where you belong. The insult wasn't loud. It was worse than that. It was casual. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest, heavy, familiar, dangerous, the kind of weight that used to make me apologize for existing. But today, it didn't. I held his gaze. He noticed then, just for a second. Something in my eyes made his smile hesitate. He frowned slightly. What? He snapped. What are you staring at? I didn't answer. Silence unsettles people who expect noise. He scoffed, breaking eye contact first. Whatever, he muttered, as long as you remember how things work. He reached for another piece of food, still convinced he had won. He smiled because he thought he had won. And across the table from him, calm and unmoving, I let him believe it. He mistook my calm for collapse. As he kept eating, his confidence grew louder, not in volume, in cruelty, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it assumes permission. You should be thanking me, he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Most people your age end up alone. You've got someone here, someone who keeps things running. I watched him carefully, not with anger, with attention. He liked that he was speaking into silence. It made his words feel heavier, more important. He filled the space the way insecure people always do, by expanding until they touch something they shouldn't. You know, he went on, I could have left a long time ago. Let you deal with everything on your own. Bills, repairs, all of it. He paused, waiting for gratitude. It didn't come. His eyes narrowed. Say something. I didn't. He scoffed and leaned forward, elbows on the table. This quiet thing you're doing? Don't get used to it. I'm not in the mood for games. Games. That word nearly made me smile. He pushed his chair back slightly, letting it scrape the floor. The sound was sharp, deliberate. He wanted a reaction, a flinch, proof that he still controlled the temperature of the room. You think you're being strong? He said. Sitting there like that? I held his gaze, steady and unreadable. That's weakness, he continued. That's you knowing when you've lost. He nodded to himself, satisfied with the explanation he'd built. His victory needed a story, and he was happy to write it for both of us. You always do this, he added. Act hurt, act quiet. Then things go back to normal. Normal. The word pressed against my ribs like a bruise. For years, normal had meant adjusting my life around his moods. It meant choosing silence over honesty. It meant shrinking so the house felt bigger for him. I felt the old urge rise, the instinct to explain, to correct, to plead for decency. I let it pass. He took another bite, chewing noisily, crumbs dotting the tablecloth like evidence he didn't notice. He reached for his phone, scrolling, disengaging, as if the conversation were already over. Then he laughed, not at anything on the screen, at me. Relax, he said. You're safe. I'm not going anywhere. The sentence landed wrong. It wasn't reassurance. It was a claim. I felt the you at UC, the deep, quiet resentment, tighten in my chest. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that sharpens your focus, the kind that reminds you exactly why silence matters. I leaned back slightly, never breaking eye contact. That was when he noticed something had shifted. His smile faltered. He straightened in his chair, studying my face as if looking for a crack. For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across his expression. What? He snapped again. What is it? I said nothing. Silence, when chosen, becomes accusation. He cleared his throat. You're acting weird. Still nothing. He laughed again, but this time it was thinner, forced. Whatever, he muttered. I've got things to do. He stood up, grabbed his plate and dumped it into the sink with unnecessary force. The clatter echoed through the kitchen. "Don't forget," he said over his shoulder, "we're done with this nonsense." He paused, waiting for agreement. He didn't get it. When he finally walked away, the house felt strangely lighter, not because he'd left the room, but because his words no longer landed anywhere inside me. I remained seated, hands folded, posture unchanged. I replayed every insult, every assumption, every word meant to put me back in my place, and I let them settle, not as wounds but as confirmation. He had shown me exactly who he believed I was. And in doing so, he sealed something he didn't even know he was signing. He smiled because he thought he had won. Across the table from where he'd been sitting, I exhaled slowly. Not in relief, in readiness. Because when silence survives contempt, it stops being submission. It becomes judgment. The knock on the door was calm, not loud, not urgent, not demanding, just firm enough to be heard. My son looked up from his phone, annoyed more than curious. He frowned, as if the sound itself had interrupted something important. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. I didn't answer. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse, and walked toward the door. Every step felt deliberate, measured, as if my body already knew where this was going. When I opened it, 2 people stood on the porch. A woman in a tailored jacket holding a leather folder close to her chest. Beside her, a man with a calm posture and eyes that scanned the space not for drama, but for clarity. "Good morning," the woman said gently. "I'm here to see Mrs." "That's me," I replied. I stepped aside without hesitation and invited them in. Behind me, I heard the scrape of a chair. "What is this?" my son demanded, standing now. I didn't turn around. The lawyer entered first, setting her folder carefully on the dining table. The man followed, nodding politely. They didn't rush. They didn't look at my son right away. That mattered. Power doesn't announce itself. It arranges the room. We all took our places. I sat at the head of the table, back straight, hands resting calmly in front of me. The lawyer sat to my right. The witness remained standing for a moment before pulling out a chair. My son stayed where he was, hovering, unsettled. "What's going on?" he asked again, louder this time. The lawyer opened the folder. Paper against paper. A sound quieter than shouting, but heavier. "I've been asked to review and confirm the legal ownership of this property," she said evenly, "and to be present while certain information is formally acknowledged." My son laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "This is ridiculous." I didn't react. He looked at me then, eyes sharp. "You seriously called a lawyer?" Still, I said nothing. The lawyer slid a document across the table, not toward him, toward me. "This is the deed," she said, "recorded, notarized, and current." She tapped the page lightly. "It lists one owner." My son leaned forward. "Let me see that." She didn't move the paper. "That won't be necessary," she replied. His jaw tightened. "What do you mean it won't be necessary? That's my house too." The lawyer finally looked at him. "No," she said calmly, "it isn't." The word landed like a dropped plate. Silence followed, thick, charged, unmistakable. She continued, voice steady. "There is no co-ownership, no shared title, no legal claim under inheritance or contribution." My son opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's not possible," he said. Your father's estate was settled years ago," she interrupted gently. "The documents are clear." She placed another paper on the table, then another. Dates, signatures, seals. Evidence doesn't need emotion. My son's face shifted. The confidence drained slowly, replaced by confusion, then anger, and finally something closer to fear. He turned to me. "You did this on purpose," he said. I met his gaze for the first time that morning. Not with anger, not with triumph, with clarity. "I didn't argue," I said quietly. "The law spoke for me." He scoffed, but the sound cracked halfway through. "This is insane," he muttered. "You're really doing this?" I didn't answer. The lawyer did. "This is not a negotiation," she said. "It's a confirmation." She folded her hands. "And now that ownership has been formally established, there are additional matters we need to address." The witness cleared his throat softly. My son looked between them, then back at me. The room felt different now. Smaller for him. Grounded for me. He wasn't in control of the temperature anymore. He was standing inside consequences. And for the first time since he walked into that kitchen believing he had won, he had nothing left to say. The lawyer didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She slid one final document onto the table and let it rest there, centered, undeniable. The paper didn't accuse anyone. It simply existed, heavy with clarity. "This confirms," she said, "that any continued residence here is at the discretion of the homeowner." My son's eyes locked onto the page. He didn't read it right away. He stared as if the words might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. "So what?" he said at last, forcing a laugh that fell flat. "You're kicking me out now?" I remained still. The lawyer answered, "That decision is not being made today, but the boundary is." Boundary. The word hung in the air like a closing door. The witness finally spoke, voice measured. "I'm here to confirm that these documents were reviewed prior to this meeting and that the homeowner requested legal counsel after a domestic incident." My son snapped his head up. "Domestic incident?" He looked at me, disbelief hardening into something sharper. "You told them?" I held his gaze. My voice was quiet, steady. I documented what happened. Not complained, not accused. Documented. "That's a lie," he said quickly. "Nothing happened." The lawyer didn't look at him. She looked at her notes. "There is a contemporaneous record," she replied. "Time-stamped." Silence returned. Thicker this time, not the silence of fear, the silence of fact. My son pushed his chair back. It scraped loudly against the floor, a sound meant to reclaim control. No one reacted. "You're really doing this," he said, pointing at me. "After everything I've done." I let the sentence end where it belonged. The lawyer closed the folder with a soft click. "This meeting is not about gratitude," she said. "It's about rights." She stood. The witness followed. "I'll be in touch regarding next steps," she added, addressing me. "If you have any concerns, call." I nodded. They moved toward the door together, unhurried. Authority doesn't rush when it knows it has landed. At the threshold, the lawyer turned back briefly. "For the record," she said, "no further discussion is required today." Then they were gone. The house absorbed the quiet like a held breath finally released. My son stood there, unmoving, eyes darting between the empty doorway and the table where the papers still lay. He looked smaller now, not physically, emotionally, as if the room had stopped accommodating him. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. I gathered the documents slowly, stacking them with care. Each movement was deliberate, respectful, final. "It already has," I said. He scoffed, but the sound lacked force. "You can't just—" "I can," I replied, not loudly, not sharply. And I did. He searched my face for the mother who would soften, who would apologize for making things uncomfortable, who would explain herself into exhaustion. He didn't find her. "This isn't over," he said. I met his eyes, calm and unwavering. "That depends on you." The words surprised even him. He looked away first. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The kitchen light hummed softly. Morning settled fully into the house. The oak tree outside cast steady shadows across the floor, unmoved. I felt it then, the satisfaction, not triumph, not revenge, relief, the kind that arrives when truth finally stands on its own and you no longer have to hold it up. I didn't argue, I said, more to myself than to him. The law spoke for me. He swallowed. His shoulders dropped just a fraction. The fight drained out of him the way air slips from a punctured tire. Slow, humiliating, inevitable. He turned toward the stairs. "Pack a bag," I added gently. "Not today, but soon." He paused, didn't respond, continued upstairs. I sat back down at the table, my posture still straight, my hands resting easily where fear used to live. The papers lay neatly in front of me, not as weapons but as anchors. The house felt mine again, not because someone else had been defeated, but because I had been restored. Quiet justice had done its work, and it had not raised its voice once. He left without an argument. No slammed doors, no last speech, no dramatic exit, just the quiet sound of a suitcase rolling across the floor and the front door closing behind him. The click of the lock echoed through the hallway, softer than I expected, but permanent. I stood in the living room and listened. For a long moment I waited for regret to rush in, for guilt to tighten my chest, for the old instinct to chase after him and apologize for choosing myself. None of that came. Instead, there was a stillness I hadn't felt in years. The house felt empty, but not hollow. The first thing I noticed was the air. It moved differently now, unburdened. The walls no longer seemed to lean inward. The rooms didn't shrink when I entered them. Silence no longer felt like danger waiting to happen. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar surfaces as if seeing them for the first time. The arm of the couch, the edge of the bookshelf, the doorway where I used to pause, listening for his mood before stepping forward. That habit took time to unlearn. The locksmith arrived that afternoon. He was polite, efficient, didn't ask questions. He replaced the locks while I watched from a distance, the sound of metal turning deliberate and final. When he handed me the new keys, they felt heavier than they should have, not because they weighed more, because they meant more. That night I slept with my bedroom door open for the first time in months. I woke once, disoriented by the unfamiliar absence of tension. My body, trained by fear, didn't yet trust peace. Healing is not instant. It arrives cautiously, testing whether it is welcome. The next morning, sunlight filled the living room. It spilled across the floor in wide, gentle bands, illuminating dust I hadn't noticed before. I sat on the couch with a cup of tea and let the quiet sit beside me. That was when the sadness arrived, not sharp, not overwhelming, soft. Grief for the son I raised, for the future I thought we shared, for the years I spent convincing myself that endurance was love. I let myself feel it. I didn't rush to distract myself. I didn't shame the tears. Loss deserves acknowledgement, even when leaving was necessary. A few days later, I made the appointment. Therapy felt like a strange word to apply to my life. I had always been the strong one, the caretaker, the woman who handled things quietly, but sitting in that small office, speaking aloud what I had swallowed for years, loosened something inside me. I learned that fear leaves marks even when it doesn't leave bruises. I learned that silence can be a survival skill, but it should never be a permanent home. We talked about boundaries, about grief, about how love does not require self-erasure. I left those sessions tired but lighter, as if I had been carrying weight without realizing it. In the evenings, I began cooking for one. At first, it felt pointless, too much food, too much space. But slowly, I adjusted. I learned how to enjoy my own company again, how to sit with my thoughts without bracing for interruption. I started making plans, small ones, manageable ones, and in the quiet that followed his departure, I realized something profound. Peace does not arrive with celebration. It arrives quietly. After the locks were changed and the house learned my footsteps again, I turned to the parts of life I had postponed for years. Paperwork first, not because it was urgent, but because it was grounding. I gathered documents on the dining table, insurance, medical directives, the deed, laying them out with the same care I once reserved for holiday meals. Order has a way of calming the nervous system. It tells your body you are safe enough to plan. I scheduled the appointment and updated my will. It wasn't morbid, it was practical. I decided where things would go, who would speak for me if I couldn't, how my wishes would be honored. I read every line twice. I asked questions. I signed when I was certain. That certainty felt new. For the first time, my future did not depend on anyone else's mood or approval. It rested on choices made calmly, deliberately, without apology. I learned to live alone in small, careful steps. I changed the arrangement of the living room, moving the chair that used to face the television closer to the window. I wanted to see the oak tree when I sat down. I wanted reminders of growth that didn't ask permission. I set my own schedule. Ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired. If I left dishes in the sink overnight, no one commented. If I read late into the evening, no one sighed. The absence of commentary was a kind of freedom I hadn't known I needed. Therapy continued. Some days were easier than others. Some days the grief came back unexpectedly, triggered by a song, a photograph, the sound of a car door closing. I learned not to fight it. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means remembering without bleeding. We talked about patterns, about how fear trains the body to anticipate danger long after it has passed, about how quiet can feel threatening before it feels peaceful. I practiced grounding, breathing, naming what I could see, hear, touch, the simple work of teaching myself that this house was no longer a battlefield. I invited friends over again, at first just one at a time, coffee in the afternoon, sunlight on the table, conversation that didn't require careful editing, laughter that arrived unannounced and stayed a while. They noticed the change before I did. "You look lighter," one of them said. I smiled. I felt it too. I took long walks in the neighborhood, relearning the rhythm of my days. I waved to neighbors without rehearsing excuses. I stood on the porch at dusk and listened to the cicadas, the way I used to years ago, before vigilance became habit. There were moments of sadness, yes. I missed the version of my son that existed in memory. I mourned the relationship I had hoped for. I allowed that grief its space without letting it rewrite my choices, because grief can coexist with peace. One evening, as the sun dipped low and filled the living room with amber light, I realized something quietly remarkable. I was content. Not euphoric, not triumphant. Content. The house felt like a home again, not because someone had left, but because I had returned to myself. I cooked a simple meal, washed the dishes, and sat by the window with a book. No one interrupted, no one evaluated, no one demanded anything. I slept well that night. In the morning, the light came in the same way it always had, gentle and patient. I made tea and stood in the doorway, looking at the room I had fought to keep, not just the structure, but the life inside it. Peace didn't arrive with applause, it didn't announce itself. It settled in quietly, like something that had been waiting for permission. And this time, I let it stay. The morning light feels different when no one is measuring you. I step onto the porch just as the sun begins to rise, the sky still pale and undecided. The air is cool, clean, the kind of air that fills your lungs without asking for permission. I rest my hands on the railing and let myself stand there, unguarded. For years, mornings began with evaluation. What mood is he in today? What version of myself will keep the peace? What should I avoid saying? Those questions used to arrive before the sun. They don't anymore. The house behind me is quiet but not empty. It carries my footsteps now, not someone else's expectations. Every room holds evidence of a life reclaimed slowly, deliberately, without spectacle. I didn't rebuild everything at once. I didn't have to. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't demand announcements. It reveals itself in small permissions, sleeping in without guilt, leaving dishes in the sink because I feel like it, saying no without preparing an explanation. I used to believe approval was safety, that if I could just explain myself well enough, love would stay gentle. That silence was maturity, that endurance was virtue. It took me a lifetime to learn the difference between being chosen and being tolerated. Now I choose myself. That choice still feels radical some days. There are moments when the old habits whisper, when I catch myself bracing for footsteps that never come, when a raised voice on television makes my shoulders tense. Healing isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. You revisit the same places, but each time with more distance, more clarity. I've learned to sit with myself without distraction, to listen to my own thoughts without correcting them, to trust that I am allowed to take up space, Emotionally, physically, quietly. I no longer introduce myself as someone's mother first. I am a woman who survived something she never imagined would happen inside her own home. A woman who learned that boundaries are not punishments, they are invitations to respect, and if respect doesn't arrive, they become doors. Some people will never understand that choice. I've made peace with that. I no longer need agreement to validate my reality. I no longer rehearse conversations that will never be had. I don't chase closure from people who benefited from my silence. There is relief in that. There is also grief for the years spent waiting to be seen, for the version of myself that thought love meant disappearing. I honor her now instead of judging her. She did the best she could with what she knew. And then she learned better. The sun climbs higher, warming the porch beneath my feet. A bird lands briefly on the railing before taking off again. Unconcerned. Free. I smile without thinking about who might be watching. For the first time, my life feels unobserved, not ignored, not dismissed, simply my own. I don't know exactly what the future holds. I don't need to. I know how I will meet it, with steadiness, with boundaries, with a voice that doesn't rush to explain itself. I've learned that peace isn't something you earn by suffering well. It's something you protect by choosing yourself again and again, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. For the first time, my life was no longer under review. As the morning settles fully into the day, I realize something that once felt impossible. I am no longer waiting, not for an apology, not for understanding, not for permission. For years, my life moved in response to someone else's expectations. I adjusted my tone, my timing, my needs, believing that love required constant calibration. I thought peace was something you earned by being agreeable enough. Now I know better. Peace is something you protect. I move through the house at my own pace. I open windows when I want fresh air. I close doors when I want quiet. The choices are small, almost invisible, but they are mine. And that makes all the difference. There are days when memories surface unexpectedly. A laugh from long ago, a holiday photograph, a moment when I catch myself reaching for the phone, almost calling someone who no longer has a place in my life. I let those moments pass without judgment. Healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means releasing its authority over the present. I have learned to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it, to trust that sadness doesn't mean I made the wrong choice. It simply means I cared deeply, and that is nothing to be ashamed of. Strength, I've learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek witnesses. It shows up quietly, in the decisions you make when no one is watching, in the boundaries you keep even when it would be easier to bend them, in the way you stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to listen. I think about other women like me. Women who stayed too long because they believed love required sacrifice without limit. Women who confuse endurance with virtue. Women who feel guilty for wanting peace in their own homes. If you're listening to this and any of it feels familiar, I want you to know something. You are not weak for needing safety. You are not cruel for choosing yourself. You are not dramatic for refusing to be diminished. Your life does not need to be approved by anyone else to be valid. There is a quiet kind of courage in choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing others. It doesn't look heroic. It doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it doesn't even feel good right away, but it feels honest. And honesty has a way of healing things we didn't even realize were wounded. I don't know what my relationship with my son will look like in the future. I've stopped trying to control that outcome. What I do know is this: any connection that exists going forward will have to meet me where I am now, whole, protected, and unafraid of my own voice. Until then, I live fully. I tend to my days with care. I nurture friendships that feel mutual. I rest without guilt. I speak when something matters and stay silent when it doesn't. I choose peace, even when it's quiet, especially when it's quiet. As the light shifts and the day begins, I take one last look at the space around me, not as something I survived, but as something I claimed. For the first time, my life is not a performance. It is not under review. It is not waiting for a verdict. It is simply lived. And if this story resonates with you, if you've ever had to choose yourself in silence, You're not alone. You're welcome here. Share your story if you're ready, or just listen, knowing that choosing yourself is not the end of love. Sometimes it's the beginning of it. For the first time, my life was no longer under review. If this story touched something inside you, you're not alone. Many of us have had to choose ourselves quietly, without applause, without permission. If you've ever lived through something similar, feel free to share your story in the comments. Your words might be the comfort someone else needs today. And if you want more stories about healing, boundaries, and quiet justice, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. You deserve peace too.